a mod to introduce the topic and stuff.
Yeah, that's fine. My thing's a little weird because I'm still in that meeting in the other server, but yeah, that's cool. I can do that. So okay, so we're gonna have an official debate. We have Shadow Starshine here. We have Jacob. For this debate, Shadow Starshine is holding the position that Jacob doesn't have a reasonable epistemic standard, nor a clear concept of what he is talking about when it comes to institutional racism. Jacob is taking the opposition. As always, when we base upon who concedes, no concessions made. We'll put it to a voting poll in which you, the audience, can vote on who you think won the debate. No time limit. One thing I do want to ask, though, because I don't think it was established, do either of you want moderation for this debate?
Yeah, just light.
Yeah, just some light moderation.
Okay, light moderation. Cool. Okay, well, thank you both so much for debating. You may get started.
Cool. Okay, I'll start with my speech. Okay, Jacob professes to have knowledge about institutional racism. My position is that Jacob's claim to this knowledge is inadequate and that Jacob ultimately doesn't know what he's talking about. This is not a position that institutional racism doesn't exist, a position that for the purpose of this debate I am not debating for or against. I have no interest in proving it doesn't exist, and if Jacob asks that I do this, he either forgot the debate proposition or never understood it. My position is against Jacob's knowledge claim. Jacob believes that he has a coherent concept of institutional racism and that this concept exists within reality. I believe he can win the debate by meeting the following criteria. Number one, coherency. Explaining institutional racism in a coherent way where it's reductios that fit his explanation and he doesn't accept them. They'll be then rendered incoherent. If he refuses to acknowledge logical extensions of his own explanation as legitimate, Jacob will be shown not to have a coherent understanding of institutional racism, and I'll consider that Jacob have lost the debate. Number two, the epistemic point. As Jacob believes that institutional racism is something that exists in the world, he must have a way to identify that doesn't beg the question. I expected to have more epistemic rigor than something like Freud's sexual theories of the subconscious, such that when people agreed with Freud, Freud would be validated. However, when people said, I don't have a sexual desire for my mother, nor want to kill my father, Freud would say that his theory of repression is correct, thus validating him again. If Jacob's concept of institutional racism has no epistemic vigor, I will consider him to have lost the debate. Number three is a definitional accuracy. Jacob's understanding will have to follow some sort of understanding of definitional accuracy, such that it has something to do with institutions as we understand them, and racism as we understand it. I will not consider it a victory if Jacob presents a coherent and epistemically justified muffin recipe. If his concept does not prove some form of common understanding of these terms, I'll consider him to have lost the debate. If Jacob fulfills these terms, I will concede that Jacob has won the debate. If Jacob does not believe he must fulfill these criteria, we can entertain why, but I do argue that they are rather minimal and reasonable requirements. In addition, first off, there were surrounding claims by Jacob to discuss. The first is white fragility, which seems to have the epistemic rigor of Freud's sexual theories. As I understand it, white fragility is characterized by a reaction towards racial conversation as a defensiveness to preserve the white ego. I'll read off an excerpt. This leads them to respond to racial triggers that show dear white people, the term WIPO, with emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, D'Angelo writes, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. The rather alarming part is behaviors such as argumentation, such that somehow disagreeing and presenting reasons why you don't accept claims about institutional racism and surrounding topics is inherently problematic. The concept of white fragility is a psychological claim about people and attempts to give reasons for their behavior. I argue that this concept cannot be validated nor refuted in any meaningful way and falls outside of epistemic vigor. Second off, Jacob has made the claim that all people are biased. I asked how he could know this, and he suggested that there were tests that people could take that would show unconscious implicit biases, such if people were asked to judge whether someone looks dangerous or looked like a criminal, and the only difference was the race, that choosing one race over another would be a bias. I accept this claim. However, when I asked Jacob what would happen if someone had the same judgment to each race on these sorts of tests, he stated they would still be biased. It seems then that the tests are pointless. When asked how Jacob then comes to the belief that they are biased, he bases it on common sense and arguments to incredulity, or appeals to other people who also share his beliefs. However, when there are disagreements between two interlocutors, Grounding your starting premises as obvious and indisputable shows an obliviousness to how conversations like these work. If Jacob has an over-reliance on these sorts of behaviors, I will consider him to have lost the debate. And that's my opening speech.
Wow, that was great. That was fantastic. I too am looking to make a coherent argument to you. And
Cool.
I'll try to make an inference to the best explanation I can, and we're gonna see if my view is coherent. I think it will be. I will have to discuss, reasons why I believe, and perhaps one should believe in the existence of institutional racism, but I'm in no way, saying you do or don't believe it under your own epistemic stand.
Sure.
Okay.
So you do
And
accept the
white
criteria that I've put
fragility-
forward?
Yeah, I think more or less. I think that seems fair, and I think, the notion of white fragility here, I think we'll get to, but it will find a place, and we'll definitely touch on that one.
Sure.
But let me sort of elucidate a little bit about what I mean by institutionalism. Okay, and
Sure.
I think it's, I don't think I'm making, any radical claims here. I think, I think my argument is pretty uncontroversial, but we'll have to see. So, racism of the institutional kind, institutional racism, is racism that occurs within the context of an institution, where someone has their own, an example of this. So we'll get to the different types, but one example of this, which is not like a exclusive definition, would be someone who, because of their own racial biases and their position within an institution, enacts their racism within the context of an institution, and therefore with the power of that institution. They have the forces of that institution at their command, and so there's going to be a much larger effect of their racism. So I would define these forms of institutional racism, let me just, because you talked for a while, as three types.
No problem.
So there is explicit racism that exists. There is implicit racism, and then there is racism merely by outcome. And that one might be controversial, and we'll maybe argue about that. But hopefully,
can you say that one
two,
again?
Sure.
Racism.
So there's explicit racism.
Implicit.
That would be something like, I have a conscious hatred of a certain race. I'm going to say something explicitly racist at them to demonstrate that hatred, make them feel excluded. I think we can all maybe agree that seems to be racist, if anything would be. Okay. Then there is implicit racism. This takes the form of unconscious racial biases that we all have. And when you ask how I know everyone has it, it's because everyone was born in a certain place and was raised and affected by their own unique circumstance. So to say that people wouldn't be affected would be to deny the fact that, everyone is raised by different parents in a different situation slightly. Maybe you're a twin with someone, but even then, your environment is going to shape you and determine your implicit biases about the world. So when we look at things like police discrimination in stops and searches, we can see that unconscious racial bias seems to play a key role. When we look at other factors, we take away those other factors, we can see that race is by far the most explanatory factor in explaining the discrepancy between the number of times people are stopped and the number of times those stops lead to searches versus the amount of times contraband is found. Because we can find that white people are far more likely to have contraband, far less likely to be searched. And it seems to be this judgment is made on the basis of race due to empirical studies, which I can link to you and we can discuss at length.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Second example would be in judge discrimination. So that once a guilty verdict is found in the case of murder, where the death penalty is on the table, In a case of black on white crime, the chance of the death penalty is far more likely than in cases of either white on white crime or black on black crime. We can see the racial bias of black on white violence appears to be, excluding all other factors, again, the single most evident explanatory factor for this this discrimination based on the judge's unconscious bias. Now, if you are a server at Dairy Queen, no one really minds if you have unconscious implicit bias, I guess, right? That probably affects your day-to-day life, but I'm not talking about that now, right? As long as you give everyone the ice cream that they ask for. But if you are a judge deciding someone's life, then your implicit bias within the context of an institution magnifies your racism, gives it a larger effect than it otherwise would, causes quite a great problem, such as the discrepancy of Black people on death row, right? Which is a real case of bias here and discrimination. Okay, then we can look at racism by outcome. So a common talking point is like, well, how do you know that the cops are pulling them over on the basis of race? Black people commit so much more violent crime. Of course, Black people are going to be targeted by the police more, but not because of race. Ha ha ha. But we can see that even removing explicit and implicit bias, the factors that lead to Black people's criminality, such as poverty, which is caused by redlining, a systemic issue created by the banks and their systematic denial of loans and credit. Reverse redlining, we can see other ways that they are being discriminated against, and their historical discrimination has influenced where they are now. But those lines created by redlining still exist. And when we're talking about this history, we're talking about ending in times like 2015 is when a judgment is passed against it. So these things are certainly not over, and things like predatory loans have risen up to sort of take the place of these sanctioned redlining by the banks. And we can again go into the history of redlining and how that was a deliberate practice based upon racial discrimination. Again, they drew those lines on the basis of race. It wasn't as if there was another reason, but simply on the basis of race. So we have now the third one, this racism by outcome, and we can see that with these disparities that exist, even without implicit or explicit bias, these discriminations historically have existed and will continue to exist, continue to propagate without some kind of addressing them at the institutional level. Okay, so I think leaving white fragility aside, and some things left to talk about that I haven't really talked about. I think we can go to a back and forth. Does that sound good?
Sure. Okay, so one of the things you've said here was when we talk about pulling people over, and that Black people get pulled over more than white people. You also said during your speech here that you would remove the other possibilities in order to show that race is the remaining factor, or at least the best explanation, right?
Yeah, the studies I have do look at the ways to eliminate 4 factors, yeah.
Well, 2.5 weeks ago when we had this conversation, and one of the reasons that I picked this proposition was because you refused that was ever necessary. And I took problem with that because I said there are other possible factors, such as poorness. You said that the mere fact that the Black people were pulled over by white people was enough to show that there was a racism.
No, you seem to have misunderstood me then, because I never said that you wouldn't have to run some kind of analysis where you saw if other factors were at play. But the studies that I'm referring to do run such analyses, and they do determine that race is the determining factor.
Well, I'm telling you that this is
And I
not the same
had
position that you expressed before.
no, of
And
of
I'm
course
glad
it is.
that
I
it
had
is this.
well, I mean, you can have misunderstood me. I'm very sorry. Perhaps I wasn't good at explaining myself, but
You could have
no, I
also
wouldn't hold
changed
the
your
position.
position.
I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't take it on the basis of faith that these things are true. There's like a pretty coherent inference to the best explanation that we can give. I'm giving you the best explanation for this data, right?
So
I don't
you're saying
know
that
what's in
at
these
no
people's
point
hearts.
you said that there was a bias, simply a racial bias, simply because more black people got pulled over by white people than white people by cops.
So I did write this, and I wrote this like after our conversation. So why is this guy getting pulled over? So there are these three reasons, as I said. There's explicit discrimination. These, like, for example, maybe that these two cops are, talking amongst themselves.
I'm asking you about what you said in the past when I made this debate proposition. Are you claiming now that you never said that?
I'm in no way changing my position. My position has always been that you need a certain amount of data to make distinction and discussion if you want to get incredibly specific about it. The thing is, if I'm shooting my shit in the saloon, right, I'm not necessarily citing multiple sources on you. Like, I have like 23 sources for our debate because you claim that I wasn't justified. Did I have those 23 sources then, or did I get them like over the week or whatever? Okay, yes, I did.
No,
research.
I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that
right.
whether or not you had references to sources is not my problem.
Okay, so there are plenty. There's like a plethora of these sources. That's the thing, is that like all I needed to do was literally like type in a few things on Google, and I uncovered these secrets of the
That's
universe.
totally fine, but it's irrelevant to the point I'm making. Right? You understand that I'm claiming that you said before the mere fact that more black people got pulled over than white people was already an indication of a racial bias. That there wasn't an analysis of data that was required. You said specifically that was enough.
No,
now, if I find you saying that, would you concede to that point?
Sure, but yeah, you won't find me saying that. You might find me like saying something that's could be misinterpreted, but no, I would definitely not say that. Right.
All right. Well, I'm gonna have to go through your history.
Simple. Yeah, you can if you want to, but like, I'm not making the argument you should just like take something on faith. I'm saying,
well, you might not be making
it is
now.
abundant. No, but it's abundantly clear that these things exist in our society, right?
Again,
so now we can move.
This debate
proposition
is not about whether or not there is institutional racism. It's whether or not you have a coherent concept of it.
Since you've agreed that my current, anyway, unless you want to create like a fantasy straw man in the past that I apparently held.
I'm not going to make a fantasy straw man. I'm going to go find the quote and then paste it in chat.
Since my current justification is coherent, we can move to the notion of white fragility. So I think.
Hold on. If I find that you had a different position before when I made the debate proposition and you changed it over time, I'm glad that you changed it over time. But obviously, when I made the debate proposition, it was about that current belief, not whatever you change it to. You could change it to any amount of things just to be right now.
That I'm not dumb. You can get angry that I'm not actually like dumb.
I don't know what that has to do with anything I just said.
Well, my point.
I never called you dumb. Whether you're dumb or not has nothing to do with my argument.
My point is that I'm not holding a false position. I'm holding like a position I've held for probably my entire life. Like, like when I look back.
I mean, you can make that claim, but if I find a quote that disagrees with that, then I don't think you can stand on that. So I'm going to take a look for this quote.
Okay. Yeah, you can go looking through my like message history. That's fine. But anyway, my notion now is about white fragility and sort of like how people tend to react when presented with knowledge about systemic racism, right? I feel like there is the tendency, I think it's happening here, to get ultra skeptical, to get ultra dug in on your position, and so that you have to, in fact, discuss and understand like a meta ethics or like an epistemological issue that's like at the root here. When in fact, what is before us is like just like some empirical fact. It's like sort of proving global warming exists. That's the equivalent sort of the thing that I would say, right? And I'm a little bit disappointed we didn't get to talk about like, what's going on in Canada, what happened there, like the residential schools. And for a moment, I guess, before we go down the white fragility path, we'll just talk about, like missing and murdered Indigenous women, right?
Why are we talking about that?
Right, because, it is further proof, right? The fact that there's like an enormous backlog of missing and murdered Indigenous women that like police did not care about until light was shone on it.
Yeah, but that's not really relevant to the debate proposition. Like,
No,
I could agree that that's the case.
Right, but this is some more evidence that leads coherence to my theory that there is some
showing examples won't show a coherence to a theory, because your theory should show us how to identify institutional racism. It's not just going to be a series of 3 examples of it.
So I do not need to create like a magical formula. All I can do,
I'm not asking for magic. I'm just asking for a coherent definition. That's it.
Right, that race exists by doing like studies that show that race is the determining factor in things like jury discrimination. So jury discrimination and the judge discrimination, and these things are not occurring, isolated. Like the fact that you have been denied economic opportunity by redlining, you have then been criminalized by like a over-militarized
Jacob, I'm not just going to let you give examples as a definition to show what institutional racism is. Like 3 examples does not a definition make. I need to know what it is.
Right, and I'm explaining that each of these things individually are examples of institutional racism. But
I just said that's fine, but that it also doesn't show your definition.
Right. But together, they paint a picture of a larger system that all works together, right? The fact is that if you are the subject of discrimination here, if you're Native American or if you're Black, you have, redlining to worry about. Then you have police discrimination, you have education denial, like of a sort of opportunity.
Can you tell me the code
of loans?
No, you have stop talking about the examples and just tell me how the examples actually prove you have a coherent understanding of institutional racism.
Okay, so my definition of institutional racism is racism which occurs in the context of an institution. And if you want to get like more specific, so period, full stop after that. But then if you want to go on further, we can say that the racism uses the institutional power or leverages that power or work through the institution, so that you're not just a cop on on your like off time, you watch like a racist cartoon, it has no effect on anything. We're talking about like an unconscious racial bias that is being enacted and is like going to influence through your power as a cop, through the institution of being.
So is your understanding, like there's one cop, let's say on an entire force, who's racist and makes implicit racist motivated actions, are we going to say that the institution is racist?
I wouldn't make any kind of claim about an institution as a an entity that exists beyond the members of that institution.
But you would say that's an example of institutional
from
racism.
a Marxist. So that system comes from like a Marxist critique of Hegel, right? So Hegel believes there's like some there-ness to the institution, and I agree that to a certain extent people are going to act differently because they're in an institution rather than just because they're individuals, right? And no one is an individual unto themselves, right? We all need we're all part of the institution of the English language that we can communicate with, right? So no one is an island unto themselves. So Hegel does have a point in that institutions can have a culture, they can have rules, they can have things that are handed down, they can have secret sort of laws or rituals like hazing or unwritten codes which exist in like the cop world, like you never rat on another cop, right?
Well, you can just limit it to whatever is part of your definition. I just want to understand your position. That's it.
Okay, so that there is a sense in which, like the Hegelian sense in which institutions have effect, but there's no institution that's like floating around like a spirit. This is only existing in, you know, the individual members of it, right? So I wouldn't, if you want to say there's, you know, an institution itself is racist, that's tricky, right? All I'm saying is there is institutional racism that plays itself out through institutions. Whether the
That plays out
institutions
how?
themselves are racist plays out how? Because, like, for instance, the judge has an unconscious bias against Black people murdering white people that doesn't exist against Black people murdering other Black people. And so through his unconscious bias, he sentences Black people who murder white people to death way more often, and like on the basis of race only, right? Or mostly, right? And so that is an
is your
example.
concept of institutional racism just require one single member of an institution to use that institution's power for there to be institutional racism?
So that would be an instance of institutional racism, sure.
That would be an instance.
Right.
Okay.
I think there are other examples, though, in which an institution can carry a set of policies that are not, you know, may have been created by a set of people, you know, didn't exist from like a Hegelian spirit realm, didn't appear, but, you know, were created by a set of people that do instantiate racism. So, for instance, redlining was, you know, a racist policy that these banks had. They decided that basically because of white flight, Black people moving to an area was going to cause white people to leave. So as soon as they saw that Black people were moving to an area, they would like draw a big red line around it and then say like, this is not a good area to invest in. And so all of the loans and everything were denied, and the home ownership loans and credit and, you know, all sorts of things were denied to people who lived in these areas, right? And so what this caused were essentially slumlords to come along who lived outside those areas who could get
Yeah, no,
loans.
I agree with all this.
You know?
I agree with all this. You can bypass it.
Right. So this redlining is an example of an institutional law or policy, right? That, you know, you could say that it is an example of institutional racism, right? That exists through a policy in an institution beyond any, you know, one member of that institution to an extent.
Okay, so all it takes for institutional racism, via your definition, is for a single member in any institution to use the power of that institution for racist means.
Sure. I mean, like, sort of like it's very tautological. Like that would be an example of institutional racism. If you're gonna then ask me, like, well, then does that make that whole institution like guilty about, like, no, or not? I'm not looking to be a purity test. I'm just saying that is an example of it. Yeah.
Okay. No, so far I don't have a problem with that. I don't know if that's particularly how people use the word institutional racism, but it would be a coherent version of institutional racism. I don't think I'd have a problem with that.
So maybe let's move to the second claim, which is like that policies, or like written and unwritten policies, can exist within institutions that maintain like racial caste systems or racial hegemony, racial biases, and certainly were drawn in the first place on the basis of race.
No, I can agree with that. Like, I can talk about redlining. I can say that sounds like institutional racism because it has codified aspects of it that are racist, right? But my problem was that previously wasn't really what you said institutional racism was. Now I'm glad that I so far I don't actually have a problem with anything you're saying. So
well,
when
your
position's improved, that's great.
I mean, perhaps the clarity of being able to talk about it in this setting perhaps has improved our communication for sure. I'm glad you don't have a problem with anything I'm saying. I mean, I have a whole lot of information here about the way Native Americans were literally unpersoned. So I guess I'm just gonna talk about that.
No, there's no point of going into specific examples because all we really want to know is whether or not you have a coherent framework and how we would go about looking for it, right?
Okay.
So I
Okay.
don't care what an example of that it's been found. I just want to know that you have a way that's epistemically valid of going about to find it.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we're good. Do we want to move? Do you want to concede? Do you want to move to the white fragility topic?
Now, I don't have a problem with the coherency of your definition so far. All it is a single individual within an institution using that institution's power for a racist mean. And I assume racism, what we both can agree, is just a bias on the basis of race.
So it can take many forms, but sure, yeah, we just define it like prejudice based on race. That's fine.
Okay, minimal. I mean, we can talk about like justified ones, like black people have more
and I
melanin
would
in
say
their
that
skin, and
right,
therefore
and
are
there,
better protected against the sun. It's not really
okay.
a problem.
So with that firmly established, I guess.
So how would you search for that? You give me the epistemic justification.
For what?
How you would look for institutional racism, how you would know it exists.
Okay, so you would look broadly at society. You would see where there are, maybe major disparities. You kind of then try to do a study or look at the reason into like why. So you try to do a targeted study. So you then like target it down to, I don't know, the police stop and search, for example, or maybe you would look at, the way that people look at security camera footage and the fact that, people are more likely to positively identify a black person they see on the security camera footage than a white person they see, perhaps because of like, the way that, the technology is limited, but it is also that gives them a chance to project their biases, right? And they are more likely to, so this is an example. So you would do a specific study like that, and you would look at the other reasons that might go into it that wouldn't be race, right? And then, you would just sort of try to rule those out. And then, the thing is, in these studies, it's not as if like it is close. It's like a close thing where you're like, like could be this, it could be that. Like, no, race is like the by far most dominant factor in them. And then beyond that, the other factors like poverty or
whether or not it is a
discrimination
factor
are
I'm not that
also
interested in that.
caused. No, let me finish. Those other factors are also caused by racism, and there's like a huge like amount of racism that goes into discussing those factors as well. So it's not just
Okay.
like, so it is a blowout. Like it's not just like
Hold on.
it's not just that there's data,
This
but
raises
it's good
questions.
data. Yeah.
This raises questions because you're saying that you eliminate other possible factors, and if what's left over is a racial bias as the best explanation, then we can say it's racist. However, it seems to be the case that if a different explanation was the better explanation, you'd still say that that factor proves racism.
So my point is in the argument, it's like you're trying to like again, this guy gets stopped by the cops. Why? Right? Now, it could be like a certain percent of like explicit racism. Okay, that's like a small percentage. It could be implicit racism, right? Quite a larger percentage, right? We find quite a bit of like the research in there is like pretty good, like across police departments, across the US, even in like, Washington, for example, like a very sort of liberal state or whatever.
But I don't want to beg the question by just
discrimination
saying it is
exists.
good. I'm just interested in the
Right.
methodology.
No. Right. No, but let me explain. So there's the explicit, there's the implicit, and then once you've gotten rid of those two, kind of like, no, the cop was racist, right? Or no, the cop had like an implicit racism. Then you're left with, oh, it was just crime that caused them to pull over, or oh, he looked poor, that's why they pulled him over, or oh, he was like this, and that's why they pulled him over. Those things, when taken on their own, like their own context, are also explained largely by things like racial discrimination. So even when you have taken like explicit and implicit racism out of the picture, which both exist, we've acknowledged they exist, then still within the remaining area, you still have some level of racism, right? Which would again be caused by explicit policies, right? Like redlining, which was denying people loans and credit based on arbitrary lines drawn on a map based on, well, not arbitrary, but lines drawn on exactly the basis of race.
So you have ways to determine racism. The things that aren't racist in that category can be explained by racism. Is there any
Well,
criteria
not
upon
entirely.
which, like,
No,
can you tell me
not
a
entirely.
falsifying way of saying that something wasn't racist? How would that go?
Well, sure, because you look at the poverty, right? You say that
Yeah.
poverty is being explained by a certain amount of racism, right? But that doesn't mean that every single person is poor because they're racist, all right? And then the fact that the cop pulls over someone because they look poor, they happen to be black, but that black person, is was not poor because of any discrimination. They were like one of the few, right? Then okay, then that is a specific example, right? I'm not saying that every single instance of this is, but the large institutional weight of these things, the force en masse of denying like an entire group of people by drawing a red line around them, like the right to get credit or loans or all of these things necessary for the American dream.
So let's talk more about that methodology. We find out that the best explanation is poorness, and it happens to be a black guy. Now, what methodology would we go about to find out whether or not that explanation still demands a racist explanation or a non-racist explanation?
Okay, so you look at why that person might be poor, right? There would be a combination of factors, right? Every individual, like, science doesn't work like asking the question, like, why is some individual poor? Like, do a scientific study on Larry and figure out, like, why he's poor? No. But we can say en masse, like, why people of a certain group were disadvantaged and are poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we can say that, the Larrys of the world were, in fact, denied loans, they were denied credit on the basis of racist policies that existed and discriminated against them, right?
Okay, give me an example of the other side of the coin. The one where it just turns out the black person was poor for non-racist means.
Okay, I mean, to be a black person in America and not have faced racism at some point, I would say is like, like incredibly difficult, right? But perhaps you live, like, I guess the only way would be to be incredibly rich. So let's say you like you're newly born, you're like born in 2001, like incredibly rich parents. You grew up in like Beverly Hills and were kept in like a bubble. You like never really faced that much discrimination. Like, okay, that person could exist.
Okay, they didn't face much discrimination.
and then they were caught for a crime because they just like decided to do it because they were bored, right? Because being rich in Beverly Hills is like a very sheltered environment, is very boring, so they like did a crime or something. Then that could be a crime they did that wasn't on the basis of race, and then they could get like pulled over. I mean,
I think that's good, but when we started with the poor person, like the explanation was poorness, right? We're saying that this person pulled them over because they're poorness. They happen to be black. Is there an example of a poorness with the fact that it's also a black person that would lead to racism, or does that automatically constitute racism? If you pull over someone because they're poor and they happen to be black, is that automatically racism?
No, there are ways to be poor and black and not have been affected by racism, I guess. But like, I mean, if you are black in the United States, like you've been affected by racism at some point, right? Like we can acknowledge that. Like the history, like being born, your parents have been denied, generational poverty, or sorry, generational wealth, and like been living like through many, generations. You have been, denied rights historically, and so you have like you're sort of born in a disadvantaged place. I would say in general. I mean, you could find like a one-off example or something, but I think that's going to be we can speak in like generalities, I guess, and say.
Well, I'm just looking for one idea of what that would look like one on the other side of the coin. I just like, would you take it that,
I tried to,
let's say a black family becomes a business owner, they get married, they have a son, their son has access to funds, but instead just decides, I want to move out, doesn't bother getting a job, doesn't bother taking opportunities, then ends up extremely poor, gets pulled over.
My intention here, or my inclination, would be like, I'm not going to view people as like making free choices and just like free arbiters. People usually make decisions, reasons, and they're sort of determined in their actions to a certain extent. So I wouldn't like, I would look at the reason why that person made that choice, right? Even if it wasn't race, it probably there was other reasons, right? It wasn't like a purely unmotivated, like, no, I just sat in my mind palace, I made this decision unto myself kind of thing. Like, it would be motivated somehow. And so does that make sense?
No, because some people just are lazy. Wouldn't you agree some white people can just be lazy and just not take advantages of financial situations and become poor?
So I just don't think it's enough to stop our analysis there. I just don't think that it's right to just be like, well, he's lazy and therefore like his morals are impure, right? Or something like that. It would be better to say he's lazy, and these are the factors that made him lazy. Like, first of all, he didn't like develop these habits early in life. He didn't like he's not in the practice, or like he's not used to doing things. He's been neglected by his system and his environment, denied education. He's been led into like economic opportunities available to him that were actually like tied to criminality and negative behavior, right? So,
but there's also the counterexample of none of that stuff happening. Like we started this with like some business owner family like, giving opportunities to their son, which they just don't bother taking.
I guess we could make a debate about like, does free will exist, right? And I could take a Kantian position where
I don't believe in free will.
It certainly empirically does not exist. However, you do have a duty to act as if it does. So we all have.
But I don't really care about any of that. What I'm asking is there, like, I'm trying to give a context that actually fits, that shows that you would decide that something isn't racist, right? Because if you can't, then you want to talk
about, right. So if you want to talk about proving like an impossible thing, haha, this is not falsifiable or something, you can, like, the prime example of that would be something like consciousness, right? Something like an interiority of another person beyond yourself, right? That's something we assume, but we can never prove. So I can never like look at you and be like, no, he made that decision because he like chose to do that. No, as far as I look at you, every decision you make will be motivated. Every cell that moves will be moved because of like another cell that moved it or whatever.
So are you trying to tell me that your beliefs about institutional racism are equivalent to the idea of believing that other people are consciousness in terms of falsifiability? That they're just, you have the same epistemic rigor?
I'm saying you have a far more difficult task to say that you can like know an interiority, or that know that I did something because it was like a free action, right? Then my claim, which is just like people act according to their circumstance, right? That claim that you made is on far shakier ground.
Which claim do you think I made?
That institutional racism exists, right? your claim that people sort of
Your
act
claim
out
is
of
that
their freedom
institutional.
in some way, right?
What? No. I'm asking you if it has the same level of you brought up this point about other people's consciousness, right? And I'm
Right.
sure we'll both
But
agree
my
that
point,
you have to
but
just
my
take
point is
that on faith
people
without proof.
can't act. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, well, I'm just
So
saying, well, we both agree that you can't take consciousness as being proven, that other people have consciousness. But you brought this up in relation to your point about whether or not you could prove that some motivation was racist or not, right? So I'm asking, do you have the same epistemic validation towards consciousness as you do to identifying institutional racism? Because then if so, then it's just an underlying assumption that it's always true.
no, because I have, an inference to it, right? I can infer consciousness existing, and I can act as if consciousness exists in others. I infer it as, the best explanation for the things I see, although it is not empirical.
Uh-huh. Well, what's the inference? Like, do you have no possible inference if a cop pulls over a black person who happens to be poor to show that it wasn't racism? Is there any possible
No, we can
inference that
do,
you could see?
right, we can do an analysis, right? Not maybe for the individual circumstance, but on the whole, to see if, over the course of like a 6-month period, if these stops were made on like largely on the basis of race or largely on the basis of other reasons, right?
Hold on, but your definition of institutional racism only requires a single example, which would make it, I assume, that you could epistemically verify that one example is in fact institutional racism. So why are we looking at the whole
No.
in order to
So
to
so
base it
my
off of your
example,
definition?
so my example of like a person who is institutionally racist, or a person who is a racist who exists in an institutional context, right? That person and the racism there is inferred, right, as the best explanation for it. The fact that I can't point to a
Well, what
single
makes it the
person,
best
single
explanation? That's
instance,
what we're trying to figure out.
right, because you've done like a cross variant analysis, or like I don't know what that word means, but like literally just an analysis where you've taken out all of the variables, and you've seen if it's being explained due to, poverty, due to other reasons, and you see that race is like the single largest explanatory factor, and that in the other largest explanatory factors, they have a large racialized component as well.
Right.
So
But wouldn't this just be
so
overgeneralizing?
no, I'm not overgeneralizing to say that due to these studies, there exist, individual cops who do these things, right? Like that is easily inferred by these studies, right? Just because I can't say that like one cop is the racist and the other cop is not the racist, like that, I don't care about that. I'm
Then
saying
why
that
does your definition like lean on that? Right? If you're saying you don't
no,
care
it
about the
doesn't. That
individuals, but your definition includes individual actions, I don't see how this is compatible.
because I wanted to make my definition as simple and as minimal as possible, right? Like
Wait,
all
it
that is
has to match
required.
the way that you
No, no,
search
no,
for
no.
it.
All that is required for institutional racism to exist is for an individual in an institution to have some kind of racist bias, either explicit or implicit, or there is some kind of racism by outcome, some kind of like policy within the institution with no one's explicit or implicit bias, and then they act through this bias through the institution, right? And so
Uh-huh.
and so when you prove that people are enacting their explicit or implicit bias, this is the single most explanatory factor when it comes to something like the death sentence, right? You look at death row, you see a great disparity. You look at other things that sort of confirm and give coherence to your picture here. You can see that there is, in fact, institutional racism going on. You don't know that Judge A did it, Judge B did it. Maybe you could by combing through the data. But again, I'm not looking to witch hunt individual people. I'm just looking to say that on average, over like this 6-month period, over the course of this study, such and such happened on the basis of race. It was discrimination. It existed within the context of an institution, and an individual used the institutional power to exert like a racial bias, right? Or
Well,
a
okay,
racial
so my
discriminatory practice.
my problem is like I could understand if your definition of institutional racism was in fact an overall analysis of those institutions while removing mitigating factors. But your definition was based off of singular individuals, but your justification can only broadly tell us whether or not somebody might have been racist. So individual aspects of institutional racism cannot be verified.
So verification is a terrible principle. So in fact, let me try to think of the white shoes example for your verification problem here. But basically, any counter example would also prove your statement. So it is, that it is not easily verifiable for an individual case is in no way, to counter its theory. Like you could say the same thing about, without wanting to derail into a topic I really don't know anything about, but like quantum physics, you can't say where like the individual position of a given thing is. You just have to but does that mean it's not real? No. Does that mean not a useful concept? No. I think, clearly, you want to make this into a thing that I have to become ultra specific about, to a point of, I would say,
I'm not asking
absurdity
you to be super specific. I'm just asking that there's a coherence. And I'm seeing a problem in between your epistemic validation of your theory and the definition itself. That's the only problem at stake here. Now, I said there was coherence.
So if I say that,
I just don't know how you search for the thing that you said. Like, if I have a definition called angerness.
So let's look for the modus ponens. Can we modus ponens this? All right. So if there is some discrimination in the police department on the basis of race, which we agree is racial, it's like that we know is based on race, then there is at least one police officer who discriminated on the basis of race. That individual was institutionally racist by my definition.
Okay, I might not actually have a problem with that. So you're going to look. So if a new institution happened and you had one instance of it, would you say it's impossible to validate until there are enough instances?
Like right away? Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to look at it that way, then yeah, I mean, sure, you'd have to do like a study or whatever.
Okay, you would do multiple
you
studies.
Could do.
Okay,
I think with absence of evidence, we move to like, I guess, shakier explanatory coherence. So like, maybe the bait, it was like the KKK they founded based on like these principles of like explicit racism, but like they haven't gotten started yet or something. Like they're on their first day. It's like, okay, I think we can say this is like a racist institution. I don't know how many studies we really need to do.
I want to try and sum this up, because when we started talking about instances, we talked about how we would go about analyzing instances, where we talked about we would look at the reasons for their poorness. And it seemed that at first, you didn't really have a problem with analyzing an instance. And if we're going to take large studies are going to be made up of multiple instances. But if we can't validate any of the particular instances, how are we going to add together data of a vague kind in order to make something epistemically valid? Right? Like if I can't have any instances, any singular instance of something, how do I have multiple instances of something?
Oh no, but you do have singular instances, because if some are, then that is literally, first of all, multiple instances. That's individual instances. That's multiple.
But how do we know that there are some? Like, where are we starting from? The individual level?
Okay. No. Okay, so we have the judges are looking at, like, I have a study here if you want. So I
just want to know the methodology.
Right. So the judges are sentencing people to death, right? So we're looking at the various ways that, or like the reasons they might sentence people to death. So we're obviously, there are quite a few factors that would go into that, like prior convictions, like your history, and like various things. So we are comparing here like to like as far as possible. And when you compare like to like as far as possible, you see that there are large gaps, and these gaps go away in certain instances that are clearly based on race when you control for race. So you look at black on black sentencing, right? When a black person kills another black person, are they likely to receive the death penalty? No, not as likely than if they kill a white person, right? And that is something that you're comparing like to like, and you're controlling based on race, and you see a large discrepancy, right? Now, like technically, we could be very empirical. We could get on our hats and be like, well, I guess we are, we can't know. Like, I'm just asking questions. Who knows? But it seems like this is the largest and best explanatory factor for these things. We've eliminated to the best of our ability all other things.
How are we just eliminating? That's all I'm kind of asking.
So you're
like, how do you go
controlling
about
for
the elimination?
So you're comparing like to like. You don't just compare someone with like 3 prior convictions to someone who's on their first. You compare someone with 3 prior convictions to someone with 3 prior convictions from like the same.
Okay. So I'm just going to
It's
assume that you're just looking at multiple correlations and making sure that the racial correlation is the highest of the correlations.
Yeah, and it's overwhelmingly so. That's the thing. And the other things that are also like significant are also largely explained by racial bias, such as like poverty and past criminality.
But I get with you to the point where you say that the racial one is the highest correlation. Therefore, we would say racism is the best explanation. Like I'm totally with you on that. It's just the fact that when it's something else, it still always seems to be racism. How do you control for the second test?
No. I mean, you'd have to do another test about like why people are have poverty, and like the reasons behind people's poverty, and the way that redlining has affected. And in fact, oh shit, I have such a study, because apparently I prepared. If I can just somehow access this on my phone, one would hope I could do so. But it is basically a study where they look at 2 neighborhoods. Both black neighborhoods, predominantly black. One that has sort of like been completely redlined, and one that somehow escaped redlining. And they're usually sort of like side by side. And we can see that, the economic disparity within these 2 places created by redlining is quite dramatic, right? And these lines left by redlining still exist in places like Chicago, places like Detroit, Atlanta, Houston. There are significant, predominantly black neighborhoods that are underserved in many, 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 many ways, right? They are underserved in terms of the simplest things, like you can't order food into those neighborhoods. You can't get a taxi in those neighborhoods. You can't, to have someone come out there is going to be more expensive if you have to get something fixed. In terms of owning a home, right? You're far more likely to have to rent a home because you're denied credit because you live within, a red line zone. So you're forced to rent, and therefore you can't even build, a reasonable amount of money to then own, and the cycle of poverty is going to continue. So we can look at this study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago on the effects of redlining. I want to maybe have a look at that, but I can show.
Okay. No, I'm not. I'll stop you there because I'm not actually having a problem with anything you're saying. But I want to go back to what you said. Institutional racism, somebody being racist within the power of an institution. However, it seems that you can also be racist because that there's racist historical context. And I'm not sure how that fits your original definition, right? Because if it requires just the bias of the person within the institution, it seems like whether or not there was a historic context wouldn't matter.
Right. So that gets us into the third of the three types of racism that I was talking about. So there's explicit, there's implicit, and then there's sort of racism by outcome, or racism with, like, imagine that you replace every single person with a robot and just see with like no interiority. It's just like a machine grinding, right? Exactly as we have it. There would still be racial discrimination. We've set up lines based on race in the past, right? We've set policies that still exist in institutions, both written and unwritten, that continue forward. And these things can function without anyone's intention, anyone's even unconscious bias. They can just, the fact that, to be Black in America, or to be Native American, like let's do the Native American in Canada example, right? That is to have grown up, either your parents went to residential schools, or you went to a residential school, or
No, I agree with any of those examples. But
right?
my problem
like,
is
the last one of those was in 1996, right? And that was
I agree this stuff happens. You don't have to prove it.
That was a group of people, like the Christian churches, the Canadian government, worked together as powerful institutions to essentially westernize Native American people, to deny them their culture, to basically offer them, quote unquote, like personhood in exchange for completely westernizing and abandoning everything. And they took away their language. And then we're not talking about the rampant sexual abuse that was
I know about these things and I agree with them.
Right?
You don't have to keep going on about it.
Right. So if you are born into this, it's not about the intentions, explicit or implicit, right? You are the product of these institutions. If we just replaced all those people by robots, but left everything as it is without fixing it. And this is sort of my critique about like a race blind.
I just want to make sure that I understand your position, because it seems if there's a cop who pulls over poor people, right? You find out that this is his particular disposition. He's just biased against poor people. Now this happens to pull over more Black people than white people. And it turns out he pulls over a Black person who has been affected in the past, and he's poor because of racist policy. Now, the fact that this cop doesn't actually have a bias about Black people, this still counts as institutional racism.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that, so we wouldn't know in that example, I guess. We could say that he would be.
I mean, it's a hypothetical. We've already said what is the case.
Right. So I'm saying maybe he would be racist by outcome there, discriminating, on the basis of being poor, right? But then if being poor is something that you've chosen for Black people on the basis of their race, and Black people are predominantly like denied chances to not be poor, and et cetera, then, I mean, without acknowledging if we're not going to talk about his biases, right, his explicit or implicit biases, then we are going to talk about, what he's doing, and he would be disenfranchising, acting as, the arm of this racist policy, right?
So I will grant that example. I don't have a problem on the coherency. I don't have a problem on the epistemic justification. But I might have a problem on the third criteria of definitional accuracy. Is it fair to say that this is what we mean by racism? That if someone pulls over poor people, does not have a bias against Black people, but the fact that that Black person was in the past disadvantaged, that this is now an instance of institutional racism. Is that really what we mean by institutional racism?
Right. So, I mean, I would acknowledge that people's sort of common sense view of racism is really only that first type of racism, I would say, like the explicit racism, maybe the implicit racism you could get on board with, but most people sort of view as like, well, I'm being racist if I'm, yelling like a racial epithet at someone. Like, yes, that is racist, but is that the bar that we should really set for racism? So I would say, and I try to be clear when I talk, is that when I say that there's racism by outcome, or there's like a systemic quality of racism or something like that, I would say that, even without looking at your intentions, we can see that there are racist systems at play that are existing, beyond the person, right? Like each person is sort of a cog in a machine, right? And when, it's not just the police department, right? The police department hands you over to, it's law and order. They hand you over to the courts, and then there's like a jury that's selected, and that actually I have studies about how that is bias and jury bias. If you're black, you're far less likely to get on a jury because you're going to be seen as like too political or too sympathetic or something. And then, there's bias in judgment after you're convicted by the jury. And then, when you look at how people are pulled over by the cops, there's like, are they denied education? Yes. Are they denied money? Are they poor? Yes. And what are the causes of that? Well, we see that race plays a factor in.
I mean, I
those
agree
things
with
as well.
like these complex understandings of race relations, and that there's all these problems that we need to look at. But I mean, what the proposition is about your definition, your coherent understanding of institutional racism. And I'm wondering here, like, should we say it's fair to say that some cop who's biased against poor people and not against black people, pulling over someone, using his power in an institution, the fact that this black person has in the past some trickle down effect of some racist policies, that this is an instance of institutional racism? Because we agree that the definition about racism is a prejudice against a race, but it seems that the only place that this is taking place in is the context of the past and not in the action itself. It's excluded from the action because that's how we've defined it in the hypothetical. So I'm wondering, does this have the definitional accuracy, which we agreed was one of the criterias of you winning the debate? Would we say that that is good enough to actually have no racism in the act itself and only part of the past?
Sure. I would say that, I think it is good to be specific when you talk, right? You don't want to, I mean, unless your desire is to sort of rile the person up, which could be politically advantageous. If you want to be clear, you can say that, you're talking about racism as an institutional process. So the person's motivations, I would say, are not the best place to look, because like, if we look at like Hitler's motivations, they could be very, very noble. He loved Germany or whatever, maybe not the best example, but, someone can have terrible or very, very good motivations and still commit bad actions, or have a good self-image, but still commit, be part of an institution or an organization that is committing terrible things, right? And I think instead of looking at someone's own sort of story they're telling about themselves, right, we need to look at instead the experience of the people that they're policing, right? And when you talk to black people, you hear that cops are racist, right? And this can bring us to the white fragility point, because I know we've been going for a while, but like,
I'd just like to sum up my position if we move on. We can talk about white fragility, but I would want to sum up my position. Is that I actually do think your definition is coherent, and I think it can be epistemically verified, because you're giving possible ways for it to be false. My problem here is now that it doesn't really have anything to do with about the institutions or racism or the act of a racist action in an institution, but more is verified by context, and that doesn't seem like what we mean by institutional racism. But that's my position before we move on, if you want to say anything.
Interesting. Yeah, I would say that, I've clearly defined it as, this act of an individual, right, that is in some way contributing either explicitly, implicitly, or through outcome to a discrimination literally just on the basis of race. So when a police officer looks and says, that person is black, for that reason and that reason alone, I'm going to pull him over and search him, right? If we see implicit bias that says the same thing, or if we have a racism by outcome, where by the very product or the policies of these systems, the legacy, whether or not someone can exist. So, we could argue if there's implicit racism, it's a factor in those situations or not, right? It could be. But whether or not those things are present, we can say that there is a racist outcome, right? An outcome that is discriminatory. It literally is different, and discrimination, and the reason for the difference is the basis of race. And sort of living through these policies, enacting these written and unwritten rules, such as redlining, such as the unwritten rule of police officers always to cover for one another. These things all help enforce the outcomes. And sort of moving on to, sort of white fragility, I would just say that my point on white fragility is just that.
You accused me of having white fragility, correct? You attest to that?
Okay, so I mean, I would in a bantery sense, because I think, it's interesting to see people's reactions, but I don't want to say like, I know I've read your mind, you have white fragility, but I do think a lot of white people have it. I think pretty much every white person has it based on being white to a certain extent. So
are you saying that my reactions to our previous conversation were not white fragility? Because you did accuse me of it. So I'm wondering if you stand by that.
Chill. Right. So you seem pretty chill, and I don't want to make like I wouldn't say they're particularly fragile at the moment. But okay. I would say that this idea of like hyper logicality, the fact that when confronted with a notion like white fragility or white privilege, there is a sort of response you see a lot that's like, well, exactly how privileged am I? Well, in exactly like this many milliliters of privilege that I have, like injected, like running through me, be exactly specific with what you mean. And I do agree, like we can have this, kind of fun epistemology debate, or my beliefs justified, et cetera, like that's all good. But to interject these kinds of debates when someone is speaking about, the racial bias and institutional bias and stuff, is a bit of a derail. It's a bit of a sea lion, or a bit of a let's go down this route, which is kind of not really the topic, right? So we can go on this route. It was fun, but I hope that maybe at the end of this, we can all now just like talk about institutional racism.
You Hopefully, did take my skepticism before as white fragility, and that was something that concerned me, was that just applying skepticism to a particular position automatically counted. In fact, I have you quoted here as saying, it is typical of white fragility to take the form of mock rational distance and devil's advocate skepticism. So, which would seem to be what you were characterizing my position as.
Right. It seemed to take that form, right? In the fact that, rather than kind of like provide a sort of distance critique, it was sort of framed as like that Jacob doesn't know X. The fact that, you were kind of interjecting into this conversation I was having to sort of go down this route. So those things sort of led me to think this, but I wouldn't want to make a strong claim. I wouldn't want to have a whole debate where I tried to prove what you thought. That doesn't seem good.
Okay. So does that mean you're sort of taking back what you said before? Like maybe you said it too strongly.
So well, I think
My previous
So
interjections to your position, are you saying they were not, or they were for white fragility, or you're just not sure? Because you were
yeah,
sure
I'm
before.
not sure. Yeah, I'm less sure than I was before. I'll tell you
Okay.
that. I don't know whether, the thing is, it's like, what do you spend your time? I would ask, like, what do you spend your time arguing about? So if most of your time
I
is
think
spent
everybody knows
like,
that.
well, I don't know. So like, I don't know you. So like, maybe it's you're just very into epistemology and you ask everyone questions about their fundamental epistemology and et cetera, et cetera. In which case, like, cool, okay. But then maybe you're going to go through every like SJW position and be like, well, you haven't carried the T and dotted the I, or you haven't looked at this exact tiny thing, or like maybe you don't know like the difference between verifiability and falsifiability. Therefore, like what you said on like racial justice is unjustified, right? So this is more of a meta critique about like maybe like a what is a useful interjection, what is like a not useful interjection, what is a perhaps like a defensive thing, because I think there is a certain amount of defensiveness. We could spoke derisively of psychoanalysis, so we don't need to push the psychoanalytic route of this, but there is a certain sense that white people live a privileged life simply on the basis of their race. So they don't know. This is not to say that white people like live a privileged life full stop, that every white person is great, or that every white person has like a better life than every black person, et cetera, et cetera. This is just saying on the basis of race, they are not discriminated against in the ways that we've sort of listed at length, right? So that is a kind of privilege that they have. And so that privilege comes a certain blindness. With that privilege comes a certain blindness. So that if you ask white people, are the police racist? They will say, no, police aren't racist. Police are completely normal. I've been treated well by the police every time I've had an interaction with them. If you ask black people, are the police racist? They will say, hell yeah, police are racist. The police are definitely racist. So with the privilege is going to come a little bit of blindness. And then when confronted with that, I'm not saying you, but it is typical to then be reacted with a certain amount of defensiveness. So that, if you come out with someone with being like, well, you actually have privilege, you are the benefit of like a racial case system country, you didn't earn this privilege, etc. People might be like, whoa, what are you talking about? Like, they might feel attacked.
Uh-huh.
And I think,
And I don't actually have a problem with that. Like that could be a possibility. My previous problem is that you were characterizing me with it. I think you might have said I had white fragility about 4 or 5 times to me before we had this debate, and it seemed that my critique was the epistemic verification or validity of that statement. If you were so loose to just continuously claim that I have it simply on the basis that I was disagreeing with you.
sure, but it seems like you disagreed with me kind of on at least a caricature of my beliefs. You didn't really take into account what I was saying, in my view. So I felt like your attack and sort of this
Well,
this
do you
debate
believe
was
I
sort of
did
set
that
up.
today?
Well, no, I think today you've been very, very reasonable. It
So
seems
you're
like
saying I
you're a
acted
true
differently
person.
the other day?
It seems like the other day you were acting, but I wouldn't make claims about how you were acting. I would just say that the other day, through text, there could have been a miscommunication. But I think it is typical of white fragility to make a posture towards a rational distance. And rather than,
Did he cut out? Does anybody else hear him? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Shadow. He definitely cut out.
Oh, okay.
I'll just ping him.
I finally got to the point where we were having a conversation. It only took me scrolling through 16 pages.
Yeah, it's been a long debate.
I mean, we have quotes like, "I believe you are just fragile, Whitey." That's something he said to me. I definitely think Jacob's position has changed and that he's been a lot more charitable this discussion. And if he can continue on, I'd be happy to him with gaining a with a victory. That's not a problem with me. I just wanted to take to task what he was saying before. I am still looking for the quote.
I was just gonna ask, like, was the original discussion in voice or was it in text?
It was
Oh god.
started in voice, and then it moved to text. And I know that there was a section in the text where he
Oh my
did
bad, everyone.
say,
I was on such a nice flow. Does anyone remember where I cut off?
no, sorry.
No.
No?
But
Okay.
I can hear you clearly now, so I'll shut up now.
Okay, I'm very sorry. Okay. So I guess the point on white fragility is that you are being, or that a common tactic of white fragility that you see in certain examples, like Jordan Peterson, where he's like get exactly hyper specific, exactly how white privileged I am, and that's seen as like a giant own, right, by the facts over feelings community, right? This kind of defensive rationalization rather than like a true rationality, this kind of like facts over feelings, hyper sort of derail into being sort of hyper skeptical, I feel is a
Why
common
is
tactic.
skepticism a derail?
I feel like it is a common tactic for being white fragile. I'm not saying that you have exhibited it, but just that it is a common tactic. But I think we largely agree that the epistemic justifications that I have for institutional racism are coherent and rational.
Right, yeah. I mean, I still attack you on part 3 of the definitional accuracy.
Sure.
But
And I would leave that up to others. So
to,
perhaps my definition is not complete. You could improve upon my definition, but I think it is at least clear. I think it gets to the heart of what I'm talking about. I think once you distinguish between these 3 types: implicit, explicit, and racism by outcome, you get a kind of complete picture here of the different types of institutional racism. I think I've laid out my point. Do you want to move to closing statements before my internet explodes?
well, we had the last one, which was you said that all people are biased.
Okay. So right.
And then I
so
asked you if
everyone,
somebody passed a test of implicit biases, that they would still be biased.
So
you agree? You said that,
I would just say that an implicit bias test.
but do you agree? You said that.
So that everyone is biased, I would take almost as an a priori claim about experience, right?
A priori, okay.
Like we can say almost, like perhaps it is empirical, like the notions. Who knows? According to the debate today, perhaps they break down, but it is a very basic claim to say that my experience justifies my belief in this thing. Does that make sense?
Well, it seems to run into the fact that, like, you're saying it's a priori. I don't know if you're actually sticking.
So I mean, perhaps the distinction would fall apart, but basically,
like, we would agree that that's a synthetic claim. It's contingent. It doesn't actually have to be the case.
Sure, I would agree. It is it is, in the end of the day, those notions do break down. It would be something I've like an empirical.
Right. But then also, if we had a test that tested for implicit or explicit bias and people passed that test, you would still say that they're biased.
Okay, so my thought though, like perhaps it is an empirical claim, but I think that it is one kind of like the law of non-contradiction, which is sort of like a necessary starting point, so that all experience, which is perhaps the basis we understand anything, can measure anything, know anything, must take place to some subject, is always from some point of view, right? There's
Yeah.
no experience that takes place from no point of view or from an unbiased perspective. And so to try to find like the root of bias in like a study on implicit bias or something, it's like, no, it is larger than that. It's like literally by your very definition, the language that you speak, the concepts that you use to understand the world, the people that raised you, like every single aspect of your life is going to bias you in some way. And like, I think
So let's agree, both of us, that there is inherent to existence biases towards your own position. But we might disagree that one of those biases must by definition be a racial one, as there are millions of possible types of ways to categorize and be biased towards something, and that they don't all have to be true.
Sure. Oh, I agree.
Right. So then, when we're talking about a contingent type of bias, why are we going to say that everyone is racially biased no matter what?
Okay, so I wouldn't say that second claim. I would make the claim that everyone is biased, because I think that's like
are you denying
like
that you said it before?
No, but I think that everyone is that, not everyone for all time, but like as we are now, everyone exists within a racial framework, a racial hierarchy. We could talk about people in the woods who have never been introduced, but even then their existence would be contingent upon political matters that would keep them in the woods, so that factors like the destruction of the Amazon rainforest, the neo-colonialism involved there with predatory companies and et cetera, is related to racism somehow. So I mean,
so you're saying everybody now is racially biased?
I'm saying that race, because of its incredible historical impact and power, has created racial bias in, I would say, all people. We could say that that's too strong of a claim, and I could back off that. I could just say, like, because you simply can't make a all statement, right? That's so we could say like Hume has got me there, but I would say like most people, or the vast majority of people in our society. So when I said all people, perhaps I was being like hyperbolic or something like that, but I would still say that 99.999% of, or there is an incredible likelihood such that we can still speak of institutional racism as a thing. We can still conclude that our society is largely racist, right? Simply by virtue of being white, you're going to have a different experience with the police than if you're black, because of
but that particular claim wasn't about historic, right? Because you said everyone is biased, so I'm assuming you're talking about people's dispositions in that claim. But you're moving to now that you think most or 99% of people hold a bias, like that's a disposition they have.
So all people are biased. 99% of people hold racial biases.
99% of people hold racial biases. Now, okay, how do we determine that?
Of some kind. I would say that, well, maybe it's not 99%, but it is a very high percent. So you can look at studies, right? And there are studies about the biases people hold in terms of race. If you look at, for example, hiring studies. So if you see that someone has the name, like a black coded name, like Shaniqua or
Well, would you
Jamal,
move
you are
your
far less
claim?
likely.
Would you move your claim to there's as much racial bias as there is we can empirically show? Like if we did empiric tests and it showed that there was biases, then we would say to that degree that's how much bias.
So not exactly. I would say that largely there are non-empirical racial biases that we just simply cannot catch or study for, right?
Sure, but why would
we
you
could
believe it?
infer maybe that we would likely infer as like a abductive reason, the inference to the best explanation. So these aren't wild leaps. These aren't just like a fancy free trotting through the library deciding, oh, everything is institutionally racist. No, this is the best explanation we have for this data. I think the data is just overwhelmingly on my side. I can provide quite a number of more studies if you are interested, but
oh well, whether or
like
not there is wasn't the debate proposition, right? Like I was never concerned about that, and I was never saying that there wasn't. Like I said that at the start of the debate, I'm not proving that there's not institutional racism. Is not my goal.
But that I am able to provide these studies is proof that I have a justified concept for my belief.
Well, not necessarily. The studies could back up your concept, but I wouldn't say they are your.
No. Individually, certainly they would not. But as a whole, they provide a coherent picture that this data is best explained by the concept of institutional racism.
All right, I think at this point we're pretty good for closing statements. Do you want to give?
Yeah, sure. So, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Either way. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So, I've hammered this home again and again. Institutional racism is racism in the context of an institution. When racism uses that institution to take the reins of power, uses the power of that institution to inflict a disproportionate outcome upon people on the basis of their race. It can take the form of explicit bias, where someone wearing the badge of authority discriminates explicitly because this person is of a different race, and then explicitly enacts that discrimination. They go over, they beat them, they arrest them, they stop and search them. This can take place as implicit discrimination, in which unconscious racial bias, such as judges in sentencing, will influence the outcomes, and the fact that there are many Black people on death row awaiting death at a far disproportionate rate. And we can see that this implicit racism is causing this negative outcome. You can see that it's the most explanatory factor for this outcome. Clearly, these judges are using their institutional power to carry out some kind of racist, implicit racial bias. Finally, we have racism by outcome. These systems work together to keep Black people within a racial case system. They are denied opportunities. Their education is denied. Their access to credit and loans denied. Their discrimination by the police, their discrimination in jury selection, discrimination in sentencing is all clearly evident. We see that, for example, white people smoke marijuana at the exact same rate or even higher rates than Black people, yet arrested far less for it. And when they're sentenced for it, they're sentenced to far less. I think going through the epistemology, we've actually, we've largely agreed. He finds this a coherent explanation. Glad there's no debate there. So whether this is an adequate explanation of institutional racism, well, I mean, I don't even, I would say that, I've probably left quite a lot out. There's been a lot that I couldn't say in this time. This is a enormous historical issue that, is probably impossible to capture all the nuances in a debate like this. So I would not make the claim that I'm perfect here, but hopefully I'm able to convince some of you that this is real. This is not something that's just dreamed up by leftists in like a cauldron. This is an issue, and that, right now we should look around. We should, take stock of what's going on, and, thanks for everyone's time. So be well, everyone. And thanks for debating.
Yeah. Okay. I'll end off mine. I think Jacob's position today was a lot better than the one that I initially argued against. Now, I know Jacob's going to say that he didn't change his position, and that's always been the case. But I actually think his position is a lot better. I still have some problems with it, but they're nowhere near as strong as when I talked to Jacob the first time. So I asked him to give an understanding of institutional racism, and we agreed on 3 different types of criteria: coherency, an epistemic way of finding out if it's the case, and a definitional accuracy. Now, I actually don't have a problem with his definition on number 1 or number 2, because I think there are ways of the correlational studies in order to prove what he's saying. And I think that what he's talking about doesn't have any reductios that show it to be, that he disagrees with, thus denying his own definition. So there's no problems on those fronts. One of my problems here, the leftover, was the definitional accuracy of having institutional racism not actually require the person involved to be racist at all, or to hold any sort of racist bias. And the fact that it's taking place in an institution seems to be besides the point, if all we need to do is look at the historical context. Because somebody could be racist outside of an institution, and it would be racist by outcome on his definition. And it could happen within an institution, and it could be racist by outcome. And the fact that it's in an institution seems to change absolutely nothing about what kind of racism we're talking about. So why it's a different category of racism, why there exists a term called institutional racism that doesn't actually require that institution to be a part of it, to me is a definitional inaccuracy. So I kind of had a on that front. The second and third claims that we talked about was the white fragility. I don't really have a problem, but I do think Jacob did back off from his claims of, calling me a whitey and saying that I had white fragility just because it seemed I was disagreeing with them. I think I got him to back off on that point. The all people are biased point is something else he said. I think I also got him to back off on that point. Whether or not you guys want to consider those concessions or not, I consider they are, because he said things in the past that he no longer agrees with, and I got him to say that, so I take them as concessions. But on the first point, you guys can decide whether or not you think that definitional accuracy is legitimate, and I suggest you guys vote based off of what you think there. And that's it for me.